We're joined by our CBSN political contributor Leslie Sanchez, senior political editor Steve Chaggaris, and Democratic strategist Nomiki Konst, who is also a Bernie Sanders supporter. Guys, you know how I like to roll. I'm going to ask questions. We're going to keep a free-flowing discussion here, all things politics. What are we looking for today, Steve?
Let's see, what aren't we looking for, right? This is a make or break day. I don't know. I'm looking directly at Ohio. See what happens if Trump can pull this out. Then I think we're seeing Trump inevitable perhaps run to the nomination. If Kasich can pull it out, then maybe it slows Trump down a little bit. I'm looking at Florida to see basically how badly Rubio loses. I think the sense is that he's not going to pull this out. You know, a miracle could happen, but I don't think anybody expects that. Going back to Ohio, I'm looking to see if Bernie Sanders can pull out a win there. If that's the case, I think it adds to the momentum that he built in Michigan. And really to this narrative that he can stay in this thing for the long run, whether the math works for him or not in terms of delegates, he at least can continue with his message against Hillary Clinton and talking about income inequality and those kinds of things.
What about you, Leslie?
It's interesting, jumping off on the Bernie Sanders point, which I always find is fascinating, that he is winning in competitive battleground states, and that's the part that's probably underreported out of everything. It's that, you know, you expect a Hillary Clinton to do well among minority groups in the Southeast and all that, but as you get to that industrial belt and the Ohio River Valley and some of these really competitive areas that Republicans and Democrats have gone back and forth for the last 2 decades, it's really fascinating to see what messages are resonating and why some of the appeal among these low propensity voters, particularly on Sanders' side and Trump's side, are coming out to show how angry they are and get engaged and really disrupt the primary.
It raises the question: where do these voters go if Sanders doesn't become the nominee? Do they go?
Home.
Do they go to Hillary Clinton? Do they go home? Or do they go to Trump?
Trump a natural fit for
That's the question,
Rust Belt.
right?
Yeah.
And the theory is that perhaps Trump could play a little stronger in Rust Belt states, whereas other Republicans might not, mainly because he's talking about these issues of trade, he's talking about these economic issues, jobs, and those types of things that are resonating with both Trump voters and Sanders voters.
Well, and they resonated with Bill Clinton, and I want to hear what you're saying, but with Bill Clinton's support in 1992 as well. It was that working white. It was the area that made it very competitive.
Though, to keep to keep everything into perspective, since in the last 15 years alone in the Rust Belt, 60,000 factories have shut down, and these are the people who felt it the worst. You know, I think they're channeling their frustration into either hatred and fear. You know, I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter, so I'm going to say this about Donald Trump, but his rhetoric, I think, is resonating with them. Blame it on Mexico. They took our jobs. Instead of blame it on the corporations which sent our jobs overseas, who have taken our wages down. Because a lot of these states haven't, even though Ohio's their economy has improved slightly, the wages are stagnant. They're worse than they were 30 years ago. So when you look at states like Ohio, I find it really interesting. I was looking at some of the numbers right before the primary started. 1,000 Democrats in Mahone County have turned to Republican, have changed their registration to Republican. And that should send fear into the Democratic Party right now. I think it's bad for Bernie Sanders. I think it's horrible for Hillary Clinton, because if she is inevitably the nominee, she's not going to win those voters. And Democrats can't win a general election without the working class white voters.
Well, I want to get back to the anger that you were just talking about and the blame game. I mean, when we've seen over the last week the anger, the fighting, the violence at Donald Trump's rallies, how do you think that's affecting voters in these key states heading into today, Steve?
Well, it's interesting. So there was polling out yesterday that asked Republican primary voters in both Florida and Ohio how that violence in Chicago would affect their vote. 2/3 in both states said it has no effect whatsoever, which is really interesting, because I think the sense was, wow, this is going to really be a turning point for Trump. At least among Republican primary voters in these 2 states, it seems that might not be the case.
But it's turning point for establishment Republicans, right? So
That's
it just shows that break.
That's the punctuation mark, and that's where Steve and I were talking about this. For individuals like the 10% that show up in primary elections, the zealots, the hardcore, the people that hang out the signs and really go to the state conventions, it's still so small compared to when you are mounting a general party or a national convention, a national nomination process. So it's key, because these are the influencers who tend to dictate where they feel the mood of the party should be. The disconnect and the tension remains that a lot of establishment and based Republican voters don't feel Donald Trump's Republican. So it's this very confused mix of who they're gravitating, their gravitational pull is getting, yes, those voters that don't necessarily engage, but are they the tried and true? What we see consistently consistently since we started, and probably last summer, is they're sending a message, and they like his style. They like style on both sides more than they're talking about who could really win.
But to Juliana's point about the violence that we've seen at some of the Trump rallies, I wonder if there is an analogy to be drawn between Donald Trump making the rounds of media outlets and saying that he's not really seeing what we're clearly seeing on videotape, and his supporters saying, look, this is an us versus them scenario, and that's why we're going to come out even stronger than we did before in support of Donald Trump.
Yeah, it seems like it's the latter, right? And then he's scapegoating Bernie Sanders, right, in the Chicago situation, and scapegoating these protesters who came and filled the arena, at least a third of the arena, with people who were out to really shut down the Trump event. And so he's saying this is all Bernie Sanders. These are anti-American voices. They're not letting me have my free speech. And he's riling his own people up to really dig in their heels and say, you are trying to stop our guy from talking.
But think about that for a second. Both Sanders and Hillary Clinton have gone after Trump in the past week, and Trump has gone after both of them in the past week, mainly because they're fighting over that working class voter. So all the theatrics aside, this is really about a demographic that both parties need right now to win an election. Donald Trump is banking on it because he doesn't have a lot of that establishment support, and he may not have it in the general election because, strangely enough, I think some of the establishment Republicans will end up voting for a Hillary Clinton, maybe not a Bernie Sanders, but I could see them voting for a Hillary Clinton, who at least is a corporatist, is somebody who is going to go in line with the general consensus of both the Republican and Democratic parties, albeit a few things on the side like unions and Planned Parenthood and some other issues.
I'll respectfully disagree. I conversely, I'm not going to get into that part, but I hear my family would be like, woo. But, and I did find some Trump supporters in my family this week, which is just shocking.
I think we would be all surprised if we didn't find
I'm quite shocked by that. There are not a lot, very few, minuscule. They don't want to be on air. But, but truthfully,
you're not going to name them?
No. Could you imagine?
Taking notes.
Could you imagine? No, that's all. The Twitterverse is going crazy right now. But the point being, I think conversely it works the other way. I think there are many soft Democrats who would pick a Trump over a Hillary Clinton, just because the legacy, the name, the establishment is somebody leadership style. Shake it up.
Right.
I think you could do. I'm not kind of giving judgment on that. I'm just saying that's really where the data is going. But you said a really interesting thing, and I think it's really an important point, is that the tracking 2/3 don't feel moved of these primary voters. Candidates, if you talk about tracking polls, like they make movements and adjustments in their demeanor and their style when they're losing. If he's consistently performing well, Donald Trump is not inclined to close that gap.
So it's interesting, and I want to talk about the unfavorables for some of these candidates, specifically Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. But there is one person whose numbers are going up. President Obama. His approval ratings are going up, and he was speaking earlier at a luncheon, the annual Irish luncheon. He had something to say about the violence that we've been seeing at some of the Donald Trump rallies. Let's take a listen.
We have heard vulgar and divisive rhetoric aimed at women and minorities, at Americans who don't look like us or pray like us or vote like we do. We've seen misguided attempts to shut down that speech, however offensive it may be. We live in a country where free speech is one of the most important rights that we hold. In response to those attempts, we've seen actual violence. And we've heard silence from too many of our leaders. In America, there aren't laws that say that we have to be nice to each other, or courteous, or treat each other with respect. But there are norms. There are customs. There are values that our parents taught us and that we try to teach to our children, to try to treat others the way we want to be treated. The notion that kindness breeds kindness. The longer that we allow the political rhetoric of late to continue, and the longer that we tacitly accept it, we create a permission structure that allows the animosity in one corner of our politics to infect our broader society. And animosity breeds animosity. We have a choice. We can condone this race to the bottom or accept it as the way things are and sink further, or we can roundly reject this kind of behavior whether we see it in the other party or, more importantly, when we see it in our own party, and set a better example for our children and the rest of the country to follow.
It's pretty rare for a sitting president to comment on an ongoing campaign, a presidential campaign. I don't think I've seen that in a while. I mean,
it is his last year.
Right.
You know, he's really nothing to lose. And I think this has gotten to a point where I think he feels the need. I mean, he said leaders aren't speaking out on this.
Right.
And, you know, he faulted everybody in this situation. It wasn't just Trump, who he was alluding to. It was also the protesters who were on his side, saying that's not the way to react to that kind of language. And so everybody sort of got a share of the blame, including the leaders who aren't speaking out. I thought that was very interesting. I think he's trying to set an example here.
Right, because what you've seen over the weekend is Republican presidential candidates. It's sort of this rhetorical tightrope that they're trying to walk, right? They're trying to blame Sanders or Clinton supporters. They're trying not to blame Trump supporters because they don't want to alienate them, but to lay blame on Donald Trump. And you know, you see this, you see what's been happening, and it cries out for leadership, for someone to just stand up there. The president, he was at a Dallas fundraiser, I believe it was either Friday or over the weekend, and he did come out and say leadership is needed, similar to this, using a bigger, more public platform today. But I think that's the question: is who is going to stand up there and stop it, and does it have to be? It has to be Trump,
But this
right?
is something that Obama's been talking about since he ran for president the first time in 2007. He was going to be the guy to bring hope and change and change Washington. And it's really only gotten worse since he's been in office. I'm not blaming him. I'm just saying that the polarization has gotten worse. And so what's the answer to that question? I don't know the answer to that question. He's trying to be a leader, I think, on the Democratic side, as the sitting president, as a Democrat, to say to at least his folks, maybe we should take the higher road here. Who on the Republican side is there? Is no one person on the Republican. Is it Paul Ryan? Is it Reince Priebus? Is it Donald Trump?
Kasich. I think Kasich took a step and a stand when he said that
who is
he
John
would not.
Kasich to the overall Republican Party?
But he's on the top of the ticket right now. I mean, he came out and said if it was a choice of joining Donald Trump, he would not. I mean, it was undeniable, and he didn't leave a lot of light.
I think you still need a larger voice than John Kasich to basically tell the troops we should be thinking about this in a different way. And who is that person? Does it come from the candidate himself who's getting the criticism? No. Is it Mitt Romney? Right? I mean, he tried, but nobody listened to him.
But it's too late. I mean, the fire's already, it's a wildfire at this point. How do you contain a wildfire?
It's going to be very hard to contain.
The media loves it. Let's be completely honest here. You know, if the media doesn't come together and say, we're not going to air this stuff anymore every time, we're not going to cut away every time he says something hateful.
Ariana,
I'd make the argument that the voters love it too. There are Republican voters who love what Donald Trump is saying, and we can talk about percentages and whatever, but there are more than are voting for him than are voting for the other candidates.
And this actually speaks to a problem in both parties. I think the parties have gotten so far away from their backbone, from leadership, from understanding that you don't always set your policy based on polls. Because when you look at the masses aren't always right. Hate to break it to America, but the masses aren't always right. And when you have leaders like this who are allowing this type of behavior, suddenly the closet bigots come out of the closet and they feel like it's allowed. And it's just something that a broader conversation needs to be had between both party leaders. Maybe they need to have a summit and broadcast that.
Well, you know, it's interesting because Jamel Bowie, who's been on Face the Nation as a commentator for CBS News, wrote a piece in Slate magazine called How Trump Happened. And he talked about what you just mentioned, Steve, that in a way, it's not just Republicans, it's not just Democrats, it's both of the parties, including President Obama, who he campaigned on unifying everybody, the entire country, and in fact, in the wake of his presidency, there's more divisiveness. Now, in his piece, he talks about the idea that many working class white Americans feel as if, you know, dude, where's my country kind of a thing because of the rise of Obama. But there's others too, working class Democrats, who, as you pointed out, may ultimately end up voting for anybody but Hillary Clinton.
But what Nomi said earlier, it just comes down to the blame. It comes down to the blame game. Who are you going to fault for the economic anxieties, for the problems that white middle class, that white blue collar workers have been facing? The decline, and the decline over the last 20 or so years. They feel like government has left them behind in their tracks.
I think what's consistent about it is it hit many socioeconomic spheres and levels. It hit many ethnicities, a lot of diversity, and the economic recession, going back to that, was really a big trigger.